Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Cooperson, and I teach Arabic literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. I'd like to thank Jalada, especially Richard Ali, for kindly inviting me to speak. And I also want to say to Wanjiri Gakuru how much I've enjoyed reading her work, which gazes on the world in a way that's both intimate and defamiliarizing. Now, the reason I'm here is that I'm the translator of a book that, according to Amazon, is counts as a work of African literature, which was a bit of a surprise to me, but it turns out Amazon is right. Here's why. The book was written in the 12th century by a man named Al-Hariri who lived in Basra in Iraq. It's a collection of 50 short stories about a man named Abu Zaid who can speak Arabic better than anyone alive, except for his wife and his son, who are equally eloquent, but they don't appear as often in the stories. Now, Abu Zaid puts his talents to preaching in the street, and his sermons move his audience to tears. But then he collects the people's money and spends it all in a tavern. His adventures are reported to us by his friend Al-Harith, who follows him from place to place, hoping to learn the secret of his eloquence. In Arabic, this collection of stories is called maqamat, which I've translated at the suggestion of my friend and colleague Shaukat Turawa as impostures, referring to the fact that Abu Zaid is always pretending to be someone else. Now, it may seem that the adventures of a lying alcoholic preacher are unlikely to have been very popular in the pre-modern Islamic world. But Al-Hariri's impostures were very popular. In fact, they were probably the most widely read work of fiction written in Arabic from the 12th century down to the beginning of the modern period. The reason is that Abu Zaid is really a device for showing off everything Arabic can do. The maqamat are written entirely in rhyming prose. Prose, that is, which is rhymed but not metered. They also contain proper verses, that is, language that is both rhymed and metered. They're rich in allusions to the Arabic literary tradition. They use a vast range of difficult vocabulary, and they're full of wordplay, including puns, riddles, and palindromes. Because of this, learners of Arabic all over the world believed that by studying Al-Hariri's stories, they would acquire the right kind of Arabic. This idea of Arabic as a global language comes through in the titles of the episodes, most of which are named after cities or regions. Among those associated with places in Africa are the Maghrib, which for Al-Hariri's audience meant anywhere west of Tunisia, including Spain, as well as the towns of Dumyat, Tunis, and Alexandria in Egypt. At one point, Al-Harith mentions traveling from Ghana to Ferghana, that is, from the far west to the far east of his 12th century world. Unfortunately, Al-Hariri has nothing to say about the places where he sets his stories. Instead, the names are meant to give a sense of constant motion in search of an unobtainable goal. In putting Al-Hariri's impostures into English, I tried to treat that language in the same way that he treated Arabic, that is, as a pretext for playing games and showing off. To serve that purpose, I decided to break with the original and do something Al-Hariri didn't do, to use as many varieties of English as possible. To my mind, if you want to show off everything English can do, yes, you can allude to Chaucer and Shakespeare and Austen and Dickens and Virginia Woolf and so on, which my translation does. But you also have to include not only standard English, but also Scots and Irish and Cockney and Jafaican and American and Canadian and Aussie and Kiwi and Naija and Singlish, to name just a few. And that's how I met Richard Ali, who kindly agreed to collaborate on the translation of one episode into a variety of English-based Nigerian languages. The result is that the English Impostures is a collection of voices, very much like Jalada's Upright Revolution project, which puts Ngugi wa Thiong'o's short story into 100 languages and counting. Now, that project is thought-provoking in so many ways. For example, the English translation is by the author himself. I'm sure I'm not the first person to ask how he did it. Did he write the story again in English and give in to the temptation to change it as he went along? I'm sure I would have. Or did he treat his work as if it had been written by someone else and strive to render it as faithfully as possible, even if he disagreed in retrospect with some of the things he had written the first time? Either way, why is it a translation? After all, what bothers us about translations is that the words we read, no matter how well written or spoken, are not the same words that went through the writer's mind as he or she wrote them. But in this case, they are. Besides that, we have the translations proper on the website in everything from Afrikaans to Vietnamese. No doubt, most of these were made from an intermediate language, probably English or French. In that sense, the project presupposes the continued hegemony of the colonial languages. But what emerges from the other end of that pipeline is a rainbow of languages, evidence that not all of us are willing to go quietly into a world where translation means simply translation into English. I'd like to conclude by quoting a friend who's a linguist, Alicia Moretti, who works on preserving and revitalizing the indigenous languages of North America. And a friend of ours once asked her the following question: if you could speak only one language, which one would you choose? Think about that for a moment. It's frightening, isn't it? If you could speak only one language, which would you choose? Well, Alicia's answer was brilliant. Sign language. Sign language. Why? If I can't speak more than one, she said, I'd rather give all of them up and learn a language that doesn't require speaking at all. So that is my fable offered as a tribute to yours. Once again, thank you, congratulations, and best of luck helping us get to a harmonious but multilingual future. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're tuning from. My name is Madhu Krishnan, or as I've been told to call myself, Professor Madhu Krishnan. However, you can also call me Madhu Krishnan. Since we're talking about translation, I'm going to start by talking about my name. My name is actually correctly pronounced Madhu, but the only people who can say it that way are people from the global south. Swahili speakers say it perfectly. Anyone from South Asia says it perfectly. Europeans and North Americans, they can't say it. So in Europe and North America, I'm Madhu. In the rest of the world, I'm Madhu. I am a professor of African World and Comparative Literatures at the University of Bristol, where I'm also co-director of the Center for Black Humanities. In addition to all of these things, for the last year and for the next 4 years, I've been working on a project inspired in great part by the amazing work that collectives like Gelada have been doing over the many previous years. This project is funded by the European Research Commission for 5 years, and it is called Literary Activism in Sub-Saharan Africa, Publics, Commons, and Networks of Practice. What this project tries to do, or what we're hoping to do, is to look at the literary ecologies that are centered from and emanating from the African continent. We're specifically looking at case studies from Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon, one of which is in fact the Gelada Collective. A big strand of our work is thinking about how would literary studies change if we took the center and we moved it from Europe and North America and placed it firmly in these regions. What would a literary theory spoken by Gelada look like? What would a concept of literature look like? So translation's a huge, huge, huge part of this. So I'm so thrilled, delighted, honored, and happy to be a part of this discussion. And it makes me even happier to know that during these strange times of COVID, we can still find ways of being together, and sometimes being together more than we can in person, because I'm speaking from the United Kingdom, occupied land occupied by fascists and ruled by fascists, whose border regime currently is extremely racist and oriented against allowing mobility for people of African descent, people who are my intellectual interlocutors, the people who I care to talk to and talk about. So it's really important to me that this COVID time means we actually have a bit more freedom to share and speak together than we do when we are subject to the Home Office and its fascist border patrolling policies. So I'm not going to talk for too long today, but I wanted to talk about a few things which relate to the scholarly perspective on literary translation, and specifically literary translation in African languages. However, I'm going to start a bit more general, because there's, first of all, a question when we think about what we mean when we talk about literary translation. And I think one of the big things we need to consider, and one of the things I think a lot about in my work as a scholar, is what do we mean specifically by literary translation? So we all know translation is a huge part of our global and interconnected world. It's a huge part of the way in which we're able to have ideas changing and moving. But literary translation is actually quite specific. And the thing that I think is really important to stress here is that literary translation, much like literary writing, is an art. It is a creative art. The literary translator is not a machine. They are not Google. They bring their own creative practice into the things that they do. This, however, brings up a huge amount of questions. There's something very specific about literary translation as a practice and an art. So my interest in literary translation has been very long going. Like many people in the world, particularly people whose heritage, like my own, is from the global South, I grew up in a radically multilingual environment. So translation's always been a huge part of my life. I remember when I was doing my PhD studies and I first encountered the discipline, the academic discipline of translation studies, how surprised I was by it, because it was saying these things that to me just felt like everybody knows this. It's like air, it's like water, but it was saying it like it was some amazing discovery. So I'm thinking here about concepts like untranslatables, or the notion of being born translated, and all these sorts of things, which we see in literary studies and translation studies, which are often used in metaphorical ways. However, for those of us who are from parts of the world which are radically multilingual, where there might be like, a colonial language, a mother tongue, a lingua franca, maybe a few other local languages floating around, these concepts are nothing new. They're not interesting. I think about the way in which, in terms of Western scholarship, the concept of the untranslatable or the born translated has only recently really hit mainstream accord, by which I mean in the last decade. But, when I think about my parents or my parents' parents, we were all living these lives for centuries. So it's nothing new to us. We've been creating this theory way before the Western world had a critical vocabulary for it. So in 2017 and 2018, along with my colleagues Ruth Bush, Zakashu Makviben of Bakwa in Cameroon, Edwige Dro of Ibrahim, 1949 in Cote d'Ivoire, and various other parties, we commissioned another colleague, Dr. Georgina Collins, to do a feasibility study on the infrastructures around creative writing and translation in Western Africa. And we chose Western Africa because it struck us as a place that's particularly interesting, having been equally invaded by the French and the British, and having a number of different linguistic ecologies and publishing ecologies that continue to work. The results of this feasibility study, which is freely available in English and in French, that you can find online at georginacollins.com at her blog, were really fascinating, because one of the things that we found is that in Western Africa, particularly French-speaking Africa, there's a huge amount of resource put into translation, but very little resource put into literary translation. We were particularly interested in the results of these interviews that were done under the framework of this feasibility study in Cameroon. Cameroon's a particularly fascinating country to be thinking about, and the history is too complex for me to even try to get into now. I don't think I would do it a good service. But one of the things that's important to know is that due to its colonial history, after World War I, Cameroon was partitioned into English-speaking and French-speaking zones, which operated on differential lines and eventually became the country we know today as Cameroon. There's a long history of colonial violence there that is extremely difficult to think about. But the point I'm trying to get across is that it is a country that is by design multilingual, with English and French, the colonial languages, with Confranglais and Pidgin, the lingua franca, as well as around 200 national languages, languages like I can't even name all of them because there's so many, and it would do a disservice to try to just name a sort of short amount of them. And what we found is that even in this country where there is a national policy towards translation and bilingualism, there's a ministry of bilingualism and translation, there's almost no infrastructure for literary translation teaching. At the universities, you can do a course in translation, you might do one module on literary translation, you might maybe do a dissertation, but there's very, very, very little actually. However, there's a huge desire. So on the back of this, with my colleagues working in partnership with Bakwa Magazine, Bakwa Books, the Bakwa Collective, we ran a series of workshops in 2019 around creative writing and literary translation to try to get Cameroonians from different linguistic backgrounds in concert so that we could pull together something. And our idea was that actually, you hear so many people talking about this, but the lack of infrastructure for translation is a huge barrier for empathy, communication, and solidarity building. I recently was speaking to a colleague who is a Yoruba speaker from Nigeria who was talking about how, there are a lot of Yoruba speakers in Benin. And so when they get together, they can talk to each other in Yoruba, and it's great, but they can't read each other's writing because the Nigerian Yoruba speakers write in English, the Beninese Yoruba speakers write in French. And so there's this infrastructural issue there. So we wanted to think about how do we break down these barriers. So these initial workshops resulted in an anthology published by Bakwa Books, Your Feet Will Lead You Where Your Heart Is, or in French, Le Crépuscule des âmes sœurs. And one of the shortcomings of this project is that it was primarily oriented to colonial languages, to English and French. We had wanted originally to have a lot more linguistic diversity in it, but we found there was actually very little skill, ability, or desire for it. So we were able to get some Confranglais, we were able to get some Pidgin, but we just thought this isn't enough, we need to do more. And so this is where the project that I'm currently working on comes into. So within the framework of my particular literary translation project that I'm doing, I've been very, very lucky to be able to work with Munyao Kilolo, who is one of the people who works with the Ngugi wa Thiong'o Foundation and the Ituika workshop, the Ikuyiya Foundation, where one of the things that we're really working on is thinking about how can we take this kind of step change and move from thinking about translation only in colonized languages or colonizers' languages to national languages. So in November of this year, 2021, we'll be doing a workshop outside of Nairobi that will be a partnership that is co-sponsored between the University of Bristol, where I work, the Itu Ika workshop, the Ngugi wa Thiong'o Foundation, that is focused specifically on literary translation and creative writing in Kenyan languages. One of the things we were really clear about is we didn't want it to just be Kiswahili. And I would really recommend anyone watching this to look up the work of Jocelyn Kiguru, one of my colleagues, who's working on my literary activism project and doing amazing work. She recently has written a wonderful piece that is in the Routledge Handbook of African Literature about the problem with Kiswahili, and the problem being that it has attained a kind of hegemony over other African languages, particularly in Eastern Africa, especially for people like me from the West. You think, well, I'll do some work in Kiswahili and that's good. I've ticked my African languages box, but that's to the detriment of languages like Kikamba, Gikuyu, Luo, etc., etc. So we really wanted to focus on linguistic diversity. And I'm really proud to say that we have an amazing participant portal. We got applications from 16 different languages. We're going to have, I think, 15 or 16 languages represented. And eventually we'll be putting together a trilingual anthology and various other things. So this is just a little bit of the work that I've been doing. But I guess what I really want to say is, in terms of thinking about literary translation and its importance, and particularly the work that Jalal Jalada has been doing in its Afterlives and Legacies is, I think it proves and it shows how urgent the need to think about literary translation is, not as a metaphor. Translation is not a metaphor. It is part of our everyday lives. We walk around and live our lives in different languages. We think in different ways. I myself, my native language is not English, and there's certain words from my family's native language that I've never found an English translation for, that for me, what's interesting for me is that they're words that really speak to affect and to emotion and to being human. And I think that this is what's so important. When we lose our languages and when we lose our ability to communicate across languages, what we lose is our ability to communicate what it is to be human. And it's not enough to just translate into English and translate back, right? Because as Ngugi wa Thiong'o told us, 40 years ago, that's still keeping the European language as the center. What we need to be thinking about is, what infrastructures do we need? What training do we need? What expertise do we need? What knowledge capacity do we need to be able to center African languages as the medium through which translation occurs? Instead of thinking, say, from Gikuyu to English to Luo, what would English to Luo look like? These sorts of questions are things that I think are really urgent. And returning to what I said earlier about, the lived experience of being in a radically multilingual context, particularly one whose linguistic context has been shaped by the violence of the colonial interruption, is we understand translation is not a metaphor. So what about if we thought about contemporary translation theory and moved the center? Instead of thinking about translation from a monolingual or a bilingual, a European or a USAian center, what would happen to our capacity to understand the critical, theoretical, and ideological capacities of language if we move the center to Nairobi or Naivasha or Eldoret or wherever else? So for me, these are the things I think are really crucial to think about. I think one of the big problems is that a lot of the discourse around language does still go through universities. And I count myself in this. University scholars were probably the worst people to be doing this. We're trained to have very narrow specialisms. It's rare to meet a university scholar who has the linguistic capacity to do the work that needs to be done, which is why this is a collective task, and we need to all work together and think outside of the university. I mean, I think about something like Jalada, I think about something like Bakwa, and I think those are intellectual institutions on par with universities and need to be seen like that. And we need to all be working together and using our resources to ensure that we can be doing this sort of work. It's what we need. If we want to liberate African literature, if we want to shake off the mantle of the empire rights back, if we want to shake off the mantle of Afropolitanism, if we want to shake off the mantle of all of the definitions that come from the North and the center, it can only be done through a collective work of ensuring the infrastructures and the visibility coming from the South is happening. I truly believe the work's already happening. We can see it. We see the translation project. We see all the things that are happening. And, I think when our anthology comes out, one of the things we've committed to is we're recording everything. Everything's going to be open source. We want people to be able to use it. We've already had people in South Africa, in Madagascar, in various places saying, can we use your materials to do our own version of this? To which I say, yes, yes, yes. Let's get 1,000 places doing local languages translation, building capacity, decentering the center, and radicalizing what we know today to be African literature to be what we know it actually is, and not the kind of European inflected version of it that we're constantly force-fed. Thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Professor Ibrahim Malumfashi. I was born in 1962 from Malumfashi in Katsina State of Northern Nigeria. I schooled right from my primary school to secondary school in Katsina State, and I obtained my BA, MA, and PhD from Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, and Bayero University, Kano. I joined Usman Danfodi University as a graduate assistant, and I rose through the rank to become a professor of Hausa literary history. I've written extensively on Hausa literary history, Hausa women writers, and Hausa pro fiction. And my current research area is on Hausa origin and identity. Generally speaking about translations and trying to domesticate translations in between indigenous African languages is a very Herculean task. I think this has to do with so many factors. Probably the major factor is the issue of the truncation of the African way of thinking, culture, language development as it was done by the colonialist. Then this has really damaged most of the thinking and the understanding of the people of African origin and those indigenous people from communicating in between themselves. We are now more or less divided or subdivided in between the colonial languages that were imposed upon us, either English, French, Portuguese, and other European colonial languages that were imposed on the African people. So the idea of trying to get people to now communicate in between indigenous African languages is now a Herculean task. Most of the translation works, as far as Hausa is concerned, is outward, not inward. When I say outward, I mean people are now more familiar with translating most of Hausa literary and cultural endeavors into the foreign languages, or what we refer to as the international languages of English, French, and such others. So right from the beginning of the Hausa people's way of communicating when it comes to literary materials, that is during the colonial times and even after the colonial times, we were more or less made to succumb to that particular subterfuge. What do I mean by that? You find most of the translations are either from Arabic into Hausa or from English into Hausa. There is no the other side of translating Hausa into the indigenous languages or translating most of the Hausa materials into Arabic and English. There are few examples one can cite of translation from Hausa to English and Arabic, but I can't see one particular example of a good understanding between Hausa language and other indigenous African languages. For instance, in northern Nigeria or in Nigeria as a whole, there is no relationship between Hausa and Yoruba. There is no relationship between Hausa and Igbo and other nearly 330 other languages that are found in Nigeria as a whole. So essentially, our major concern as far as the study of Hausa literary translation is concerned has to do in trying to see how we can be able to capture the nuances of the international languages, most especially Arabic, English, and French, into Hausa. Way back in 1929, when the colonial people established the Translations Bureau, that was the task given to that particular agency. That is to domesticate most of the materials they can find in Arabic and English, and sometimes in French, back into Hausa. And a lot was done in between 1929 after 1945. Many materials were translated from Arabic and English. Some for teaching in the nascent primary and secondary schools established by the colonialists, and some just for entertainment and reading and art culturalization. But essentially, translating Hausa from Hausa to other languages within the African continent, I don't think there is really anything that one can pinpoint. And that is a challenge, not to only the Hausa studies intellectuals, but the government and agencies that are concerned with the development of Hausa as a language. Probably what Ngugi Thiong'o did some few years ago is what is required to make our languages in Africa to communicate, to now have a certain special treatment or relationship in between themselves. We need to start making the journey inwards. There is really nothing that prevents us from making translations from Swahili into Hausa language, or from Hausa into Swahili, being the two major dominant indigenous African languages. Time has really come that we now have to look inwards. There are so many materials that we can be able to harness and then put them together for the benefit of the African people, for the benefit of our indigenous people, instead of just relying more or less on the so-called international languages or the dominant colonial languages in all those aspects of our life. So probably we need to have a symphony somewhere. We need to have a meeting point somewhere. I don't know whether it's coming from the African Union or it's coming from the local regional associations, whereby you can sit down, map out a way that you can be able to now say, let's make it a policy that most of the materials that we have in our indigenous languages should be able to now go around all the indigenous languages instead of going out or adopting from the foreign into our local settings. And I think that will give us a room to now maneuver, to now understand that cultural transformations can only take place when we know what we are and how we can be able to at least digest what we have as an indigenous people or a people coming from a particular continent with our own synchronic and diachronic understanding of our lives and literature. In other words, what am I trying to put across is we need the coming in of governments, organizations, non-governmental organizations, and all these to be able to at least sit down and map out a strategy that we can be able to say, this is time for us now to look inwards and start talking to ourselves, start making things appear local, appear indigenous, and then we enjoy the vast knowledge that is there within the African continent.